We definitely won't raise hands and do confession here, but how many of you have ever been let down by your spouse? You know? You're not supposed to raise your hands right now, okay? All right? So that's going to cause more problems. Now your spouse, now you have another argument when you get home, okay? And sure it happens. I get the privilege today, I'm officiating in a wedding, and they're going to make promises to each other that we're always going to love each other, and we're always going to be there for each other, and we're always going to serve each other and help each other. And we all of us have been married for a little while ago. You're going to break every one of those promises, you know? You're not going to keep those promises. It's going to happen, you know? It's not going to work out exactly the way you think. Now, we're praying and hoping that it is going to work out, that they'll stay together, that they have a covenant relationship. But you know what? In our marriages today, we have to work through a lot of broken mess. We have to work through a lot of broken promises. God, on the other hand, is not that way. And He always keeps His promise. Every single time He keeps His promises. And but often when we look at our relationship with God, we say, you know what? When I signed up with Jesus, I thought it was going to be this way. I thought my finances were going to get better. I thought my health was going to be good. I thought this situation in my life was going to turn around. I thought that it was going to be great all the time. And you know what? God often has a whole different agenda and plan than what we thought. And so many of us have been disappointed with God. There's a lot of people today that say, you know what, the reason today that I'm not in church is because I went to church, I hung out with some of God's people, and I got burnt. I got hurt. They did this to me. They lied to me. They were dishonest. They acted this way, and then I found out that they were this way. And so therefore, I'm turning off the whole church thing. I'm turning off the God thing. God kind of messed with my life. He broke His promises to me. Sometimes just our general belief in God, we say, you know what? I'm following God. He's a strong God. He's a capable God. And then God allows some tragedy to happen in your life. You lost someone close to you. Your health failed. You lost a job. You had a bad situation happen in your life. And you say, you know what? I don't know if God can really keep His promise. Maybe He wants to. Maybe He's not strong enough. Maybe He's strong enough, but He just doesn't care enough about me. And so, therefore, I'm not going to believe in God. I'm not going to follow God. I think today there's a lot of people who say they don't believe in God, that their reason is really based on the fact that they're really angry with God. It's not they don't believe in Him, but they're angry with Him. We do that sometimes with our family, right? You know, you get mad at somebody. I know we got two kinds of personalities out here. Some of you are fighters and some of you are lovers, right? Okay, you got two kinds. And so some of you, when there's a conflict, you raise your fist up, okay? Some of you, when there's a conflict, you run, okay? How many of you are the fist raisers? All right, you're the fighters, okay? How many of you go run? All right, you usually got. And sometimes what's funny is you got. If you have in a family, you got both personalities in the marriage. There, you've got a fighter and you've got a fight and a flight person. And so the one person they want to stand and fight, and the other person's going running, and then they're mad because you won't come here and fight me, you know. And so we don't never get that conflict resolved. One person's running, the other person's going looking for them. Okay, all the time trying to deal with that, and you never deal with what's going on there. And so sometimes we get mad at God, and so sometimes we get angry at Him. Sometimes we go run from Him. We stay away from church. We stay away from God. Today, what we want to see is the fact that God always keeps His promises. And how do we respond to a God who sometimes does some things in our life that we don't always agree with? And today in Romans chapter 11, we're going to see that God has always kept His promises to the nation of Israel. And that's probably one of the greatest illustrations of God's faithfulness, His relationship to Israel. Let me kind of review with you just a little bit about what this is about so it'll make sense. Because when we finish today, we're not just going to be talking about God and Israel. We're looking at this as a picture of how God is faithful to you and how you ought to respond to Him. And so one of the things that we see in the nation of Israel, probably about 1500 BC, so we're talking about 3,500 years ago, they were slaves in the nation of Egypt. And then a guy Moses came along, and God said, you know what, I'm going to set you free. And He brought them out of slavery, and they went out into the desert, and they got the 10 Commandments, and God gave them the tabernacle, and He began to meet with them, and He says, you're my special people. I'm going to bring you to the promised land, and it's going to be yours forever. And so it took them a little while to kind of figure out how to relate with God and how to respond to Him, but about 40 years later, they made it into the promised land, and they got in Palestine, where we know the nation of Israel is today. They were there. And they were there for for a while, for probably about 800 years. But while they were there, they had kings and they had nations, they had prospered, and they had their own temple, and they had the nation there, and it was great for a while. But the last couple hundred years that they were there, they began to drift away from worshiping God. Oh yeah, they would worship God in the temple, but they would also worship idols. And God began to send prophets and say, you know what? If you don't listen to me, I'm going to take you out of this land. I'm going to take away your temple. I'm going to take you away from here. But the people said, no, wait a minute, God, how are you going to do that? You promised that we would always be here. We would always have the promised land. And God said, I told you you're going to have the land, but if you disobey me, I'm going to take you out of it, at least for a while. And they didn't believe God, and about 600 BC, God brought the nation of Babylon in and literally destroyed their temple, burned it down. They couldn't believe that God's own temple could be destroyed. They didn't think God would ever allow them to do that. There's a prophecy that talks about how the glory of God literally went out of the temple and left, and it wasn't there, and He just let them have the city and everything else. He took all the important people out of the land, took them over thousands of miles away over into Babylon, and they stayed there for about 70 years. And the people of Israel were just devastated. They couldn't believe that God would bring them to the promised land, let them be in it, and let them have the temple where they could worship God, and they were God's own special people, but then He would take away that. But about 70 years later, He begins to bring them back. Not quite the way it was before. They didn't have their own king. They didn't have their own land. But they built another temple back. It wasn't as great as the one before, but they had that for a while. And they began to worship God, but God said, you got to focus on me. You got to worship me, or things are going to change. He says, I'm always going to keep my promise. You're always going to be my special people, but you need to obey me. And so they had that for a while, but then they began to lose that, and the Romans came in, they took over. And about the time that Jesus is on the scene here, and He comes on the scene, they're in their own land, but they don't get to rule their own land. They're under the charge of the Romans. And God told them then, He says, one day I'm going to destroy this temple. But He says, I'm always going to keep coming back to you, Israel. And about 70 A.D., the temple got destroyed again. And Israel got removed all over the place again. And you know, for the next about 2,000 years, Jews were all over the world. In fact, you can go to almost any nation in the world, and the Jews are all over the place. But somehow, God has helped them keep their identity as a nation. And then we know in 1948, God brought them back, and they're there in the nation of, they're back in their own land again. They don't have their temple yet, but we can see how that they keep God keeps working on them in some way. But as we look at this chapter here in Romans 11, a lot of the people here, they've listened to Paul for 8 chapters, and he said, here, I'm going to keep working on Israel, and I've always kept my promises. And he says, but now I'm telling you, Gentiles, you who aren't Jews, here's a way that you can be right with God. And about chapter 9, people say, wait a minute, I got a question. You said we can be right with God. You said we can be in your family, but I look at what's happening to Israel, and I'm not so sure that, God, you can keep up your end of the bargain. I'm not so sure you can do this. Some of you ladies have experienced this. You had a guy who, when he was dating you, said, I'm going to provide this for you. I'm going to be here for you. I'm going to do this. He was offering to marry you, to be with you forever. And you were looking at his track record and you said, I don't know. I don't know if he can deliver. I don't know if he can carry through with this. I don't know how long he's only kept a job for 3 months. He's only doing this. I have to pay for half of my meals when I'm out with him. And so I don't know if he can really do all the things he's saying he can do. Sometimes we look at God and we say, can He really deliver? And so in this chapter here, God is saying, I want to show you how I can deliver. I want to show you how even when it looks like I haven't been keeping my promises to Israel, I have been. And how therefore, when it doesn't look like I'm keeping my promises to you, I am. And so in Romans 11, I just want to read through this chapter, and then we're going to quickly take some lessons away from it. In Romans chapter 11, Paul says, I ask then, this is on the other side of your yellow sheet if you want to follow along. He says, I ask then, has God rejected His own people, the nation of Israel? Of course not. Paul says, I myself am an Israelite. No, God has not rejected His own people, whom He chose in the very beginning. Elijah the prophet complained to God about the people of Israel and said, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars, and I am the only one left. And God told him, no, I have 7,000 others who've never bowed down to Baal. Sometimes we think we're the only ones, and God isn't doing what He said He would do in our lives, but it's how we feel, but it's not real. Elijah thought he was all by himself, but there were at least 7,000 others who were also following God. He just didn't know about them. In verse 5, it says, "It is the same today, for a few of the people of Israel have remained faithful because of God's grace, His undeserved kindness in choosing them. And since it is through God's kindness, then it is not by their works. For in that case, God's grace would not be what it really is, free and undeserved." So this is a situation. Most of the people of Israel have not found the favor of God they are looking for so earnestly. But did God's people stumble and fall beyond recovery? Of course not. I want to stop here and just show you something that you already know. How many of you know somebody who's Jewish? You ever met somebody who's Jewish? Not so many people around here, but I spent some time in New York City. There's a lot of Jewish people there. And here's the conversation I have with that I've had with some of the Jewish people that I've known. I remember one time I was talking to somebody in New York and was trying to introduce them to the Christian faith and share that with them. And they said, "I hear what you're saying," but they said, "I'm a Jew." Like, I can't do that because I'm a Jew. And their general thinking is that because I'm a Jew, I can't be a Christian. I can't follow Jesus in that way because I'm a Jew. I have a different religion. It's tied into my physical DNA almost as far as who I am. And if you look at most Jews worldwide, most of them are not followers of Jesus. They have their own religion. They call it Judaism, and they follow the law, and we have a lot in the Old Testament, but they're not Christians. And so they're not followers of Jesus. And so Paul is saying to the folks here, he says, you might think that God has messed up His plan since most of Israel is outside of God's plan right now. And he says, that's not the case. And here's at least 3 reasons why God has always, He's doing it today, He's done it in the past, He's always kept His promises to Israel, even when there's been some ebb and flow in the nation of Israel. The first thing is, Paul says, hey, I'm a Christian. I'm a follower of Jesus. God saved Paul. He says, I'm a Jew, and I'm a follower of Jesus. And so I have a personal example there. But number 2, he says there's always been at least some Jews who've been a Christian. There's always been at least a remnant somewhere. There's never been a time when there weren't at least somebody that God was working His plan through, and you could see evidence, a little seed of God working out His plan. But the other thing you have to understand too is that even though God chose people, He never chose Israel because they were better than everyone else, and now He's just kind of lost favor with them. He says that God chooses people by grace. Look at verse 5 and 6. He says, it is the same today, for a few of the people of Israel has remained faithful because of God's grace, His undeserved kindness in choosing them. And since it is through God's kindness and is not by their works, for in that case, God's grace would not be what it really is, free and undeserved. You see, a lot of the Israelites felt like, hey, God chose me, and because we're His special people, we're better than someone else. And God often reminded them, look, I didn't choose you because you were better than somebody else. I just chose you just because. Just because. This last week, we went to the SPCA and adopted a puppy. And some of you have seen our puppy. We had her out at the church service last week out in the Marsh Run Park there. And so, how many of you have ever adopted an animal? You ever went somewhere and picked one out? Okay? What do you look for when you adopt an animal? What do you look for? You got different things. What do you look for? It's okay. What do you look for? They look for you? Okay. What do you look for? Gentleness. Okay. They're cute. Okay. No ugly dogs in that house. All right. What do you look for? Anybody else? What's that? Okay. Some of you want a boy dog. Some of you want a girl dog. Okay. Or cat or whatever you're looking for. Okay. All right. If they're housebroken. All right. I don't know how you can tell by looking at them, but, are you going to go where you're supposed to go? What'd you say? Face features. All right. Anything in particular you're looking for? Just okay. All right. They look a little crazy. Say no. You know what? Now, and so often when we go, you go in the pound or you go in the SPCA and you can walk around there and you can look and say, you know what? Here's some dogs. They ain't ever going to get adopted, because they got issues, Some of them are sick. Some of them are old. Some of them are, they got 3 legs or they got, 5 legs. They got something that's just different about them. Nobody going to pick that one out, okay? And you got some of them in, they're young, they're puppies, and they look nice and everything. You say, they're going to get adopted quick. And so sometimes we think when God goes about choosing a people, when He goes about choosing His nation, that He's kind of like us. He's looking for something that, is great about them. Oh, you know what, they're good in this way, or they're better than these other people. And God reminded people, He says, you know what, when I chose Israel, they weren't great. They weren't any better than anybody else. In fact, in some ways, they were worse than everybody else. They were slaves. They were nothing. They weren't anything special about them. I chose them just because. Some of you are that kind of person. You walk into the SPCA or somewhere, and you see the animal, and you go, you know what? No one is going to adopt that animal. So that's the one I'm picking. I'm going to pick the one that no one else would ever choose, just because. They got nothing in there that's calling out to anybody, so I'm going to choose them. Some of you are the real softies, and that's the way you are. In that way, God is like that. That's the way He chooses people just because. And so we look at verse 6, and He says, when I chose Israel, when I chose anybody, He says, it's never because they deserved it. He says, I chose you just because. It's not because of their works. And so what happened there is that Israel over time began to think, you know what, we're special. We're great. We're better than everybody else. And so one of the reasons that God chose them is so that they could be an example of an unlikely person chosen by God who could then spread His love out to the world. Israel was supposed to do that. But what did Israel do? Israel said, you know what? We're special. I'm going to keep God's love in here. We got Him. Nobody else can have Him. I'm not sharing Him with anybody else. And we're going to keep Him to ourselves. And God said, wait a minute. You're messing up with my plan. My plan was to love you, but to use you to spread my love to the world. And because you're not doing that, now I've got to work my plan so that other people can get in on this. I wanted it to start with you, Israel, but I don't want it to end there. But He says God kept working on things here. And so what God did is God began to judge Israel, and God switched His program to working primarily with Israel to working primarily with the church. And most of the church today are not Jews, they're Gentiles. How many of you are Gentiles? If you're not a Jew, you're a Gentile. I don't know, what is a Gentile? If you're not a Jew, you're a Gentile. You're one of the two, okay? And so in verse 11, we learn, why was God so hard on Israel? Why is God so hard on people sometimes? He says that God's people stumble and fall beyond recovery. Of course not. They were disobedient, so God made salvation available to the Gentiles. But He wanted His own people to become jealous and claim it for themselves. The second thing there, the reason God was so hard on Israel, is He wanted to make Israel envious. Some of you did this back in the day. I hope you haven't done it recently. But how many of you, don't raise your hand. I'm just asking you to get you thinking, okay? How many of you ever had a relationship where you felt like, the other person wasn't paying enough attention to you? You remember back in middle school, I hope it was middle school. I hope it wasn't last year for you adults here. And you felt like, he's just not showing me enough attention. He's not showing me he really cares. And so, what you decided to do was to make him jealous. And so instead of just going down and sitting beside him at the lunch table, you went and sat down beside some other guys at the table. And just kind of acted like you were interested in them. And the whole thing wasn't you weren't interested in them, but you're trying to get the attention back on you. You ever seen people do that? We've seen people play that game, right? Play hard to get, or play the jealous card there. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But in this case, God said, you know what? I can't get Israel to know how great it is that I have chosen them by me just focusing on them. In fact, they've actually rejected me, even though I'm continuing to love them. So here's what I'm going to do. I still love them, but I'm going to turn and I'm going to really pour out my love and my blessings on the Gentiles. And when Israel finally looks up, they're going to turn around and they're going to, wait a minute. Man, look at what God's doing over there, and it's going to make them jealous. And hopefully, what it's going to do is it's going to cause them to want to come back to me. Chuck Swindoll gives an illustration one time. He says it's kind of like you are the Gentiles. All of us are Gentiles. Like we're dishwashers at a country club. And when you're a dishwasher at a country club, you don't have any rights or privileges, right? The club owners come in, they get to play the golf, they get to do everything, they get the meals, and we're just kind of working there. We don't have any rights or privileges. We always got to let people go to the bathroom ahead of us. We got to probably have our own bathroom somewhere else. We got to stay away from the food. And it says, say a bunch of Israeli businessmen come in, and you serve them this great, big, beautiful banquet meal. But they start talking among themselves, saying, we don't want to eat this right now. Let's go play some golf. We don't want this food. We'll set it aside. So they leave the banquet without even touching their plates. And in the meantime, the owner of the restaurant comes in and says to the dishwashers, hey, since they left all those good meals out here, I don't want them to go to waste. All you busboys and dishwashers, you come in, you get to have the banquet. And so all of us, we're sitting down there and we're eating this wonderful meal that normally we have hands off. We can't even get around it. We're just supposed to be serving other people while they eat it. We're eating that. And in the meantime, the restaurant closes down. They shut everything down. And the Israeli guys, they finish out their golf game and they come back to the restaurant and it's locked. But they can look in through the windows. And as they look in through the windows, they see all the busboys and the dishwashers just cleaning up that meal. And they're not allowed to have it. They want it now more than they ever wanted it. Chuck Swindoll says that's kind of like what God is doing now, pouring out His love on the Gentiles. He's trying to make the Jewish people jealous because He really wants everybody to come back to Him. In verse 3, verse 12, He promises, He says, now if the Gentiles were enriched because of the people of Israel turned down God's offer of salvation, think how much greater a blessing the world will share when they finally accept it. One day God's going to bring it all back. And so there's going to be even greater good when Israel comes back to God. Now, sometimes when we have a chapter like this, sometimes we look at it like it's all history. And we look at it like, well, there's Israel. Oh, great, I don't really care about the Jewish Israel thing. I got my own situation in my life to deal with. But right back to the beginning, what we were talking about is, have you ever felt like God's been unfaithful to you? See, there's a lot of Israelites today, a lot of Jews who've turned away from God and said, you know what? God said He's going to send a Messiah, and He never sent Him. He has sent Him through Jesus, but they don't think He sent a Messiah. God hasn't loved Israel. He's allowed the Holocaust to happen. He's allowed so much to go on, and they say, I don't know if God still cares about my life. But what about you? What about me? Have you felt like God's ever turned His back on you? You felt like God has allowed you to have hurts or hasn't done something in your life? So what are our takeaways today from this chapter here? Some of them are going to be for those of us who are followers of Jesus. And some of them are going to be for those that God is still trying to bring into His family. The first one is this. For those of you who are followers of Jesus, God wants you to always be grateful for His grace. Always be grateful for His grace. You know the song, Amazing Grace? Amazing Grace. Is it still amazing to you that God saved you? Have you ever gotten to the place where you're like, it doesn't amaze you anymore, but you kind of feel like, you know what? I've been a Christian so long that, I think God's kind of glad that He has me on His side. I bring a lot to the family of God. I am so amazing. I've been in some churches in some places where there are folks that are so pious. They've been Christians so long, and they're always at that church that they almost make everybody else feel bad for being around them because they're so much holier than everyone else. God doesn't want us to be that way. He wants us to be grateful for His grace. Always amazed at the fact that He did save us. We've looked at verse 6. Look down in verse 17 and 18. It says, some of the branches from Abraham's tree, that's some of the people of Israel, have been broken off. And you Gentiles who are branches from a wild olive tree have been grafted in. So now you also receive the blessing that God originally promised to Abraham and his children. But you must not brag about being grafted in to replace the branches that were broken off. You're just a branch, not a root. Do you recognize that, back to our illustration, being in the spiritual SPCA, the spiritual pound, when God chose you, He didn't choose you because you were a good-looking pup. Okay? He didn't choose you because you looked like you were already spiritually housebroken. He chose you because you look so pathetic. He says, if I don't choose you, nobody ever will. He chose you just because. He just loved you just because. And if you ever get over that, if you ever start thinking, well, God chose me because I'm pretty good, you're missing out on how wonderful God's grace is to you. You don't deserve it at all. Some of you who just got out of favor with your spouse, I'm going to give you a chance to get back in, so pay attention. How many of you would be honest and in a public assembly here would say, I married better than myself. I married above myself. Go ahead, let's see here. I got both hands up, okay? I'm giving you a chance here. Now, some of you are lying right now. You're like, I don't think that, but I'm going to raise my hand, okay? I'm let them think that I think, that I didn't deserve them, okay? What I've seen in a lot of relationships, if you really look at a relationship like, you know what, this person, I'm just glad that they said that they love me. I'm amazed that they said they love me. They really bring more to the relationship than I do, and I'm just amazed by that. You know what? You're gonna have a humbleness in that relationship, and you're gonna treat that relationship as extremely valuable and not take it for granted. And God wants us to do that in our relationship with Him. Verse 25, He says, "I want you to understand this mystery, dear brothers and sisters, so that you will not feel proud about yourselves. Some of the people of Israel have hard hearts, but this will only last until the full number of Gentiles comes to Christ." Look at number 2. And there's another takeaway. Always be grateful for God's grace. But number 2, remember to humbly honor God with my life. Remember to humbly honor God with my life. We ought to just say, you know what? I don't deserve to be in the family of God. I'm so grateful that I am. I'm just here to serve Him. One of the things I love about our church family here, and I'm not trying to say anything bad about any other church family, but I don't know too many church families that are this way. We have a whole lot of folks here that are just amazed that God has saved them, and you're just here to serve, and you say, you know what, I want to help other people. I love how 2 weeks ago we work at Marsh Run, and literally almost our whole church is over there helping out in some way just because. We don't worry about, well, let's get the people to come here to our church. Let's get them to come here to our building. No, we go to them. We go out into the community, Thanksgiving time and summertime at Marsh Run and other places, and we say, you know what? God's been good to me. I want to help out in any way I can. I want to just honor God with my life. Any way I can help out, I want to do that. And that's what God wants us to do. The third thing we can take away today is that we need to prove our salvation by staying the course. Now, I need to be careful with this because some of you will misunderstand. I did not say you earn your salvation by staying the course. How do you get saved in the first place? How do you get in the family of God in the first place? What did you have to do? Just accept, right? You didn't have to do anything because you couldn't do anything. You were the undesirable puppy at the SPCA, and nobody wanted you. And all you had to do was be willing when the owner stepped in and says, I'm willing to take you home, is to get in the car and go with them, okay? Or just let them carry you. That's really all that you did to be in the family of God. You said yes to the love that Jesus has poured out on you, okay? Now, you could have said no. You could have refused to go, but really you didn't do anything, okay? You've done nothing to earn what God has given to you, okay? And so if you've done nothing to earn it, what do you have to do to keep it? What do you have to do to keep it? Just hang on for the ride. You can't do anything. You didn't do anything to get it. You don't have to do anything to keep it. Now, sometimes here's what we think. Sometimes we think, you know what? I have to trust Jesus by faith, but the way I keep my relationship with God is I have to do good things. Elena gave a good example. Some of you know my wife, she was adopted when she was 4 years old, came over from Korea. And so I don't remember right now. I've heard a lot of the story, but it's blurring in my head right now. I don't remember exactly how she got chosen. I think she was sponsored for a while financially by her adoptee parents. But when they chose her and she came over, they just chose her just because. Okay, some of you have adopted a child on like Compassion International or somewhere, and you just you choose a child just for whatever reason. Something tugged at your heart, and you said, "I want to choose this person," and you just choose them. And so they adopted her and they bring her over. And she becomes their daughter. She's officially their daughter. What does she have to do to stay in that family? Nothing. Is she supposed to, her parents tell her she's supposed to clean up in the house and sweep the floors, and they give her chores to do. If she doesn't do those things, is she no longer adopted? No. Now, there's some kids that come over, especially if they're older and they have understanding, they think that they have to do certain things. They think they have to get in good with the family or they're going to lose their right and privilege. But if it's a really good, healthy situation that's modeled after God's kind of love, then they don't have to do anything. Now, it's nice if you do something, but why does she do the chores? Because she's a member of the family. She's not doing it to stay in the family. She's doing it because she's in the family. She's not doing it to impress anybody there. You and I can't impress God, but we do those things because we're in the family, not to stay in the family. Now, you don't want to run off, okay, and lose and walk away from the blessings that you have, but she'd still be in the family. One of her sisters has had some times when she hasn't been in good graces with the family, But you know what? She's still part of the family, okay? If one of my boys runs off and decides, you know what, I'm not in the family anymore, does that change anything legally? You know? No. He's going to be a little more poor when he's out on his own, okay? But he's still a family member. He's just not, living under the house of blessing. And so we don't have to earn our salvation, but we need to prove our salvation by staying the course. Look at verse 29. It says, "For God's gifts and His call can never be withdrawn." God's gifts and His call can never be withdrawn. In other words, I've had some people say, you know what? When I was young, I sensed that God was calling into my life. He wanted me to be a pastor. He wanted me to follow Him. And I didn't do it. And I think I've messed it up. I don't think I can ever go back. I don't think I can be right with Him again. What does this verse say to that? For God's gifts and God's call can never be withdrawn. Yeah, you messed up some time. You lost some time. But if God is calling into you and you're hearing Him at this moment right now, guess what? It's proof that God's promise is still there. He still cares about your life. He's still calling out to you. Some of you have a testimony where you can say, you know what? For years, I can see where God was working in my life and I was telling Him no and I was pushing Him aside. How many of you have a testimony like that? You say, you know what? I know for years God was coming after me. And I said no. And you know what? The fact that God stayed on you year after year after year, and you're here today, and you're hearing this message now, what is it telling you? God's call and His gifts are irrevocable. They're not going to be withdrawn. They stay on you. Now, sometimes we don't always submit to that. Sometimes we fight that, but it's still there. It is always there. God designed you that way. Now, here's the thing. Some of us fake parts of our lives. Some of us live a certain way, and it's not really who we are. But here's one of the things I found in life, and you know this true. Time will always tell who somebody really is. Time will always tell what's really there. And so one of the things that we have to look in our life whenever you're tempted to step away from God is say, you know what? If I'm a true child of God, I'm going to stay the course. Because God's holding me. But so I just need to stay the course. I just need to live it out because a true child of God can never really walk away. There's a verse in 1 John that says that when you see somebody totally turn their back on God and walk away and never ever come back, what it says is it tells you that person has never really been in the family of God. They gave the appearance they were in, but they were never really in. Because if you're really in, you can't get out. Okay? If you're really in, you can't get out. Here's how I've seen it in my life. I've messed up after I have come to Christ in faith. But here's what I can say in my life. When I was 15 years of age and I said yes to Jesus, you get to be my boss. I'm following you from this point on. Yeah, there's been times I've stumbled and I've fallen away. But honestly, deep inside, the God of the universe at that moment took up residence in my life and changed me forever. I will never, ever be the same. I can't imagine what it would be to walk away. Sometimes I've tried to fight God since then. But it's like, God's saying, you can't do that. Go ahead. Throw your little punches out there. You can't mess with me. You're in my family. I belong to you. You try to walk away. See what happens. And you know what? I can't. I'm coming back. I can't do it. I can't walk away. You can't do it. How can the God of the universe take up residence in your life and transform you and you ever go back on that? You can't do that. You are marked. You are forever changed. And so what this passage is telling us is prove that. Okay? Not make it happen. God makes it happen. But you just show that that's really who you are by just staying with Jesus. Don't fight Him because you can't do it anyway. And number 4 is this. Here's our takeaway. We need to be grateful for God's grace, humbly honor Him with our life, prove our salvation by staying the course. And number 4, don't fight what God may be doing during your tough time. See, the times when we have trouble believing God's promises is usually the tough times. It's usually when something happened and we're like, God, that wasn't in my plan. And what God is saying to us is, it's not in your plan. It was in my plan, and I'm doing it for some reason. Now, let's review here a little bit about why God has taken Israel through some tough times. Does it mean He doesn't love them? Does it mean He's not going to eventually come back and finish up His promise with them? No. He might be using your tough time to save someone else. He might be using your tough time to be an illustration to someone else. Remember the jealousy thing that God is doing with Israel? He may be showing someone else the value of your relationship with God. Look in verse 14. He says, "For I somehow want to make the people of Israel jealous of what you Gentiles have, so I might save some of them." Sometimes I think God allows you and I to go through some tough times. And so that people around us, even some of the ones who are giving us the tough time, they look at our lives and say, man, how do they go through that? How are they managing to stay so strong? How are they managing to ever have a smile on their face? How are they managing to do that? And they say, it's because of your relationship with God. It's because of that, that they have that situation. They can go through that. And then finally, God may be up to some good of which we may never fully know. We may never fully know what's going on here. It says in verse 25, it says, "Some of the people of Israel have hard hearts, but this will only last until the full number of Gentiles comes to Christ, so that all Israel will be saved." As a nation, they're going to be saved one day. "For God's gifts and His call can never be withdrawn." And listen to how he finishes out here. "Oh, how great are God's riches and wisdom and knowledge, how impossible it is for us to understand His decisions and His ways. For who can know the Lord's thoughts? Who knows enough to give Him advice? And who has given Him so much that He needs to pay it back? For everything comes from Him and exists by His power and is intended for His glory. All glory to Him forever. Amen." I want to finish with, I'll give you, this is not on your outline here, but if you want to write down Lamentations chapter 3. It's a long chapter, but it's a great chapter, and I'm going to just give you a little piece of it here. I would love for you to take it home and look at it. Remember when I was telling you that after Israel had been in the land for about 800 years, and then to their shock and surprise, God finally had enough of their disobedience and their idol worship, and He took away their temple. He allowed a foreign, ungodly nation to come in and destroy their kingly dynasty, take away everybody out of the land, literally burned up their city, and they were left in ruins. And they couldn't believe that God would allow that to happen. They thought because they had His temple there, that He would never let any of that happen. And Jeremiah, after it happens, he was left in the land. He was one of the few people left. And he's literally walking through the city of Jerusalem, and it's in ruins. I don't know if you've ever been in a place right after a war. A city has been bombed and literally been destroyed by war. And there's just devastation. I mean, there's no people there, and the few people that are there, they're wounded, they're hurt, or there's skeletons around, there's just debris, and it's awful. And you can just see like some disaster has happened there. And he's walking around there, and here's some of what he says. I'm starting in verse 16. Jeremiah says to God, he's having this conversation about God. "He's made me chew on gravel. He's rolled me in the dust. Peace has been stripped away, and I've forgotten what prosperity is. I cry out, my splendor is gone. Everything I hoped for from the Lord is lost." You ever felt that way? God's not keeping His promises anymore. He smacked me down. He's messed with my life. He's broken every promise He's given to me. "The thought of my suffering and homelessness is bitter beyond words. I will never forget this awful time as I grieve over my loss. Yet I still dare to hope when I remember this." Here comes the hope. "The faithful love of the Lord never ends." He's walking through a city where he doesn't see anything left of God's blessing. And he says, "The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is His faithfulness." You wonder where that song comes from? Right here, that verse there. "Great is His faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh every morning. I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance, therefore I will hope in Him. The Lord is good to those who depend on Him, to those who search for Him. So it is good to wait quietly for salvation from the Lord, and it is good for people to submit at an early age to the yoke of His discipline. Let them sit alone in silence beneath the Lord's demands. Let them lie face down in the dust, for there may be hope at last. Let them turn the other cheek to those who strike them and accept the insults of their enemies. For no one is abandoned by the Lord forever." Now we have moments, don't we, where we feel like God's turned His back on me, where I feel like I've got nobody there. You've had a moment, right? Every one of us has had at least a moment. Some of you might be in your moment right now, where we felt like, you know what? I feel like my prayers bounce off the ceiling. I feel like God isn't there. I feel like I'm in the darkest time of my life. I feel like nothing I do matters. I feel like nothing is working out. But he says, for no one is abandoned by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he also shows compassion because of the greatness of his unfailing love. For he does not enjoy hurting people or causing them sorrow. He's doing it for a reason. He's not wasting your pain. Everything is for a reason. You and I may not know the purpose of it in this life. We may not know why He's doing what He's doing in your life. I've shared this with you before. My son Nathan was 4 years old. He's in a hospital for 5 weeks. And for the first week or so, we didn't even know what he had and what the deal was there. And I remember, especially during that first week, and watching him getting 2 spinal taps and all kinds of needles and tests and all kinds of big disease names and crazy stuff thrown out there. I remember how scary it was and just wondering what was the purpose of it all. And then it turns out he was going to be okay. It just took a while for he had brain inflammation, and it took a while for that just to kind of calm down and on its own. And took him 5 weeks later to kind of get rehabbed and learn how to walk again and all those kind of things. And often I had conversations with God and asked Him what you've asked Him when you've gone through a difficult time. I had one question, 3 letters in it. Why? Okay, God, you say you're faithful. Why? What was that about? You show you love me. Why? What was that about? And you know what? To this day, I don't know the answer to that question. And one of the things I've learned is that God always has a why, but God doesn't always tell you the why. God always has a why. And if there was any easier way, He would take you through that way, but He's not always going to tell you. Sometimes if He did tell us, we couldn't understand. But He has a reason. But God always keeps His promises. So we're back to Jeremiah now. He's walking through a city where there used to be a temple where they would worship God, and now God has allowed His own temple to be destroyed. The whole nation is gone. As a nation, they were defeated. They were wiped out. They were taken away from their land. And Jeremiah is probably thinking, you know what? How is God ever going to keep His promises? God said that all Israel was going to follow Him one day, and they were going to be in their own land, and they were going to be the pinnacle people. And He's saying, how can it happen? We've lost everything. We're going to lose our identity. We're in a foreign land. There will be a day now when we look around and we say there are no more Jews. We've never even heard of them anymore. They're a civilization like the Hittites or somebody else that's disappeared off the face of the earth. That's probably how Jeremiah felt at that moment. He saw no way that God could keep His promises. Yet he said, no one is abandoned by the Lord forever, and great is the Lord's faithfulness. And my Lord is my inheritance. I'm just going to hope in Him. I don't have a why right now, but I know God has a why, and I'm just going to trust in Him. And now today we look back. 2,500 years later, we look back, and Israel is back in their own land. During World War II, during the Holocaust, the Jews should have been wiped out. I mean, you think about how many millions were killed and everything that happened, and they had their own land. They didn't have their own land. There's no way, without God keeping His hand on them, that they are still alive. The fact that there are Jews today and that there's a nation of Israel in Israel today on that land is proof that God has never taken His hand off of them. And what God is saying to you today is, if I can do that kind of amazing thing, can keep a certain people from being exterminated just because I chose them and they're my special people, when you're in your dark time and you're wondering if I can keep my promise to you, look at Israel. I loved them just because. I love you just because. Don't get to a place where you're not amazed at my grace. Don't forget to just honor me and follow me, because I'm going to keep my hand on you. I have a plan. Can't explain it to you right now. Might not ever tell you about it, but I'm going to work out some good. I'm going to use you to bring other people to me. I'm going to do something great in your life, but it's going to be a long, long time before you ever realize the significance of it. But I always keep my promises. He's the only one that can say that to you. Some of you have a great spouse who you've been married to for a long time, and they've done a lot of great things, and they're the greatest human being you know. And you know what? God outshines them, because that person has at some point has let you down, at some point has given you a promise they haven't kept, even as great as they are. God never breaks any of His promises. He always keeps every single one of them. And so today, what I want to encourage you to do, I want you to go home, I want you to look at Lamentations 3, I want you to look at Romans 11. And I want you, as you open up Scripture, I want you to start claiming promises that God has given you. I don't know when He's going to keep them, but I know that God is going to keep them in your life. Let's close in prayer today. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you. I don't know what else to say, but just thank you for keeping your promises. You are a great, great, awesome God. And Lord, I pray for that person who's here today who has almost turned away from you because they felt like you had hurt them in some way. Lord, I pray that your word will reassure their hearts that even though they may not fully understand, but that you always keep your promises. Lord, I pray that for that person who's here today who's never yet experienced what it is to be a family member of God's family, I pray that they'll see that you always keep your promises. That no matter how far down they are, you can save them. You can rescue them from sin and self. From the things that we can't change in our lives, you can change. And that you are always, always faithful. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.